Okay, let me start out by saying that I am not going to present a paper to you. This is not a paper. And since this is a one-off talk, I haven't timed it or anything like that. So if somebody could give me like a 10-minute warning, it would be really useful. Thank you very much. I don't usually go on too long, so I don't think it'll be a problem. So this is instead a talk that zeroes in on my favorite paper of Aloysius's in the context of the time in economics when it was written and when it came out. So this is sort of an exercise in nostalgia. And I have to do this because I don't actually have any stories about Aloysius. And we were talking about this a little bit earlier. We should have met in grad school, and then I'm sure I would have had stories because I was at Northwestern and he was at Chicago at the same time. And I spent a lot of time in Chicago because I was working with some data that I had to go to Chicago to analyze. So I was taking the L and then the IC down to Hyde Park. And then based on the advice that was given to me before it got dark, I would hightail it back to Evanston because I was told it wasn't safe. And I would sit there and they would mount my tapes and, you know, we would run the things and so on. But we never met. And it turns out that one of the reasons is that we hung out at different labor seminars. And I used to go to Mel Reeder's labor seminar, which was in the business school. And Aloysius, I guess, hung out at Gary Becker's labor seminar. And I remembered, since I talked to you earlier, Aloysius, that I did go to one of those seminars because there was somebody that I really wanted to hear who was presenting a paper. And after that, I thought, oh, no, no, this is not where I'm hanging out at all. And so I went back to Mel's seminar instead. I'm going to cough anyway, but but thank you. So it's going to take me a while here to get to Aloysius's paper, but it took us a while to get here. So there we go. So when we were in graduate school, labor econometrics was discovering women. And I've been spending a lot of the last couple years thinking back at how the economics profession has dealt with women or with gender issues more broadly. And this seemed like an opportunity to zero in on one little phase of that I hadn't really gone back and reviewed. So I'm going to do that, but we're not there yet. Okay, but it was all going on when we were in grad school. We'd finally got a bunch of panel data sets that were now usable. There was a PSID, there was the SIME-DIME income maintenance experiment data, which is what I used. Later on, we got NLSY 79. There's all this panel data. And the great thing about women is that there was variation. Sometimes they worked in the market and sometimes they didn't. And that changed over their life cycle and so on. And so econometrics was sort of poised to exploit this variation. And so we get Heckman and Willis, who discovered that, you know, if the labor force participation rate of married women was 60%, did that mean that 60% of the women worked all the time and 40% never worked? Or did that mean that each woman worked approximately 60% of the years? And so Heckman and Willis were going to use the panel data and parameterize that. Hausman and Kogan were using the fact that, you know, they've got corner solutions and nonlinear budget constraints, and they're using maximum likelihood models to trace out the labor supply function and so on. So all of a sudden, we went from, well, we have to drop all the women out of the sample because who knows how to deal with them. And we'll just estimate all our labor supply models on men, to great excitement about modeling the labor supply of women. So that's what happened. There we go. So why was there this sudden interest? Well, I think it was really tools based, as I sort of said. We had, you know, the available cross-section and time series. We get a lot of variation. We get, you know, the development of econometrics. But I suppose there was some other stuff going on as well. You know, the labor force participation rate of women, especially married women, had been rising rapidly for a while. And my guess is there was a lot more personal salience among the modal economist who was and is a man. They knew more women who were working, possibly they had spouses who were working, and so on. And you know, a minor detail is there were getting to be more women in economics, and that probably had an effect also. I took this book off my bookshelf where it had been for a very long time, and I skimmed through it and reconfirmed what I had remembered, which was all the authors were men. But at the time, there weren't very many women around. And so Fran Blau was just getting tenure at Illinois, having just published her first book. Claudia Golden wasn't really working on women at this point. She was mostly doing the history of slavery, but she had just published one paper on women. She was at the time failing to get tenure at Princeton and moving to Penn. There really were not very many women around, and there certainly weren't very many senior women. All right, the cohort that's now the super senior group was just emerging and only just starting to work on women at all. So here's the economics version. This is completely a side track here because I spent a lot of time working on CSWEP data and collecting CSWEP data, as many of you may know. And the only consistent data we have on women in economics during this entire period comes from the initial surveys that CSWEP, the Committee on the Status of Women in the Economics Profession, did in the early 1970s. And then for years, CSWEP used the UAQ data, which the AEA collects for US departments, but the response rates are terrible. And so the intervening data is garbage. And then in the early 1990s, CSWEP took it back and paid a lot more attention to getting a good response rate. In recent years, the response rates from departments that have PhD programs has been essentially 100% because I or whoever was the current chair of CSWEP would personally email department chairs and say, get it in. Your department was slow last year too, get it in. And so you can see what's going on is during the empty period here in the 1970s and the 1980s, the fraction of junior economists who were women was rising very rapidly. And so this is sort of the period that we're talking about here. Just a little bit of history. I mean, women were sort of not part of the economics discussion for a very long time. And so women don't appear in Wealth of Nations. Adam Smith wasn't too concerned about that. At the time, he considered services to be unproductive labor because no commodity is produced. And, you know, some discussions at the time of household labor was that, well, household labor was motivated by altruism, not by rational calculation, and therefore it's not a proper subject of economics. But a few years back, somebody discovered some lecture notes taken by a student from a series of lectures that Adam Smith had been giving that he intended to turn into a third book, but never got around to producing the book. And he apparently was intending to deal with women in that book. And so he makes the statement in the lectures, according to the lecture notes, that biological differences between the sexes are obviously a constant, but the social significance of gender depends on the material and cultural character of society. Okay. And so this was sort of, there would have been the beginnings of an economics of gender, but we didn't actually get it. The only reason I'm going to mention neoclassical economics just for a moment is to encourage you to go look at this paper by Pandey and Roy, which was based on Rohini Pandey's Alfred Marshall lecture, which I believe she has changed to the Mary Paley and Alfred Marshall lecture, in which she discusses sort of Alfred Marshall, that great pioneer of economics, who actually married the first female economics lecturer at Cambridge, and then immediately began a completely vociferous campaign to keep women out of Cambridge and out of economics. It's a really terrific paper. You should go and read it. Okay, on towards the present. So women don't appear much in neoclassical economics. Alfred Marshall declared that they didn't belong in neoclassical economics. During the Great Depression, which we just heard a little bit about, a lot of economists, and many of them actually women economists working in government agencies, paid a lot of attention to what was going on in households, all right, to documenting household production, which was an important part of production during the Depression. They actually collected a lot of data on time use, on how household goods were produced and so on. And then, in the 1960s, we get the so-called new home economics, Mincer and Becker originally at Columbia, and later, of course, Gary Becker working on marriage, fertility, and time allocation. And that takes us to the 70s and the 80s, which was where I began, and econometrics discovering women's labor supply. So the question is, where are we at this point on gender inequality in economics? And I think what we've discovered in recent years, or what has been made very clear in recent years by Clevin and all his co-authors, documenting using data from many different countries, that if we are asking the question, why do women earn less than men, the proximate cause of economic gender inequality is clearly the household division of labor, right? Not ruling out discrimination, the devaluation of women's work, exclusion from some occupations, those things are real. But when you look at what happens to lifetime earnings, you can see it's the appearance of children in the household that really causes the deviation between the earnings trajectory of men who carry on as before and women who on average do not. So the household division of labor is the fundamental driver of economic inequality between men and women. And economics has grappled for many years on explaining why this is the case. And the focus of what I want to talk about is this period in the 1990s when a whole series of papers came out basically theorizing the gender division of labor, okay? And the basic idea of this set of papers, and we're not at Aloysius's paper yet, was, can we explain gender specialization in market and home work with no inherent differences between men and women and with competitive labor markets, right? And the whole idea here was coordination, all right? So we're going to try to explain gender gaps without gender differences, or as I recast this question, someone has to be the mom, right? And that's the basic idea behind all of these fairly diverse theoretical papers. There's really two varieties of them. They're both based on the interactions between men and women in households. The idea is everybody gets paired up. Every household consists of one man and one woman. And on the potential gains to specialization in the household, but they differ in where the coordination takes place, all right? Coordination takes place either in the labor market via the allocation of jobs, good jobs versus bad jobs, or the allocation takes place in the marriage market via human capital investments, all right? So in both cases, it's important that we assume no inherent, no biological differences between men and women. It's all going to be about economic incentives, right? And the reason this is a nostalgia exercise for me is I refereed tons of these papers, right? So this was just at the stage of my career when I was starting to get asked to referee papers from good journals, and they sent me this stuff over and over again. So I'm going to sort of go through two classic papers of this variety, one of each type, all right? I know I refereed Patrick's paper for sure. I don't remember for what journal, but I definitely refereed this one. So the idea here is behind Francois's paper is men and women are organized into two-person households. That, as I said, is a fundamental of these models. Each individual is responsible for a total of cap H of household tasks. So these H tasks have to get produced, and each person in the household is equally well endowed with household-specific human capital that lets them provide H cheaper than they can get it in the market, okay? Because if you can outsource all your H, then the whole thing falls apart. The labor market now consists of two job types. There are good jobs where workers receive an efficiency wage premium to deter them from shirking. Remember those models? And there are bad jobs where there's no premium. Okay. And so the question is going to be, well, who gets the good efficiency wage jobs? Well, what we have here is that you have an effort endowment, and you can either spend your effort at work, right? Or you can spend your effort producing household tasks, right? And this means there are potential gains from trade within the household. If one member has a good job, they can spend all their effort not shirking on the job and getting their efficiency wage payment. and the other person has a bad job, so it's okay if they waste their effort producing H for both of them. And notice this is kind of like another Becker story where women get paid less because they're less productive on the job, and they're less productive on the job because they're tired from doing all the work at home, right? So same basic phenomenon here. Firms who have efficiency wage jobs would rather hire workers with non-efficiency wage spouses because they can pay them less and still have them not shirk. Okay, so that's the basic idea. And suppose it's not easy to observe the job status of potential employee spouses, then if all the other firms are discriminating by hiring only one sex for efficiency wage jobs, then Francois shows that any single firm will have an incentive to do the same. All right, so it's a coordination equilibrium where we simply assume all the women have the lousy jobs. We assume that means that the men are available for the efficiency wage jobs where they can work hard on the job. Okay, so that's the basic idea. And there follows much math, a great deal of math, exploring different possible equilibria. Francois shows that you can, sex discrimination is clearly an obvious stable equilibrium here. There are non-discriminatory equilibrium. He shows that they do exist, but they tend to have a stability problem. They tend to fall apart. Okay, so that's the basic idea. So we don't need to assume any sort of differences, gender differences. We can get discrimination in a competitive labor market just through this coordination facility. This has a lot of really nice features. One thing I distinctly remember was reading all these papers and thinking, wow, these are really clever. These are really clever models. Francois points out this is consistent with the observation that that at the time, most of the male-female earnings differential can be attributed to occupational segregation. Men and women tend to have different jobs rather than get paid different wages at the same jobs. There's a male marriage premium. Men's wages go up when they get married. That's also consistent here with them being able to move into these efficiency wage jobs. And Francois points out that as marriage is declining, we tend to see falling wage differentials, right? The coordination just doesn't work quite as well. He also cranks through some policy implications. Affirmative action, if it's applied widely, can in fact shift us from a discriminatory to a non-discriminatory equilibrium, as long as there's one that's stable. Childcare subsidies might work and they might not work. So that's a basic idea. The other one, and was published the next year, was Gillian Hadfield's coordination model of the sexual division of labor. I enjoyed this paper so much rereading it. I hadn't read it for years and I had sort of forgotten a lot of the details, but it's a wonderful paper. This actually sets up a contrast, which will soon be relevant, between the biological models of the sexual division of labor and the coordination models. Okay, so what she asks is does specialization and therefore the gender gaps in earnings depend in some way on inherent differences between males and females? And the paper begins with the presentation of tons of anthropological evidence from 183 societies that shows that though gender specialization is ubiquitous, right? There are always men's jobs and women's jobs. The specific division of tasks is not the same everywhere, right? So hunting large aquatic fauna tends to be exclusively male in those societies that do that. And it turns out cooking vegetal foods, not meat, but vegetal foods is almost exclusively female. But a lot of jobs that are women's work in one society are exclusively men's work in other societies. And so burden carrying, mat making, crop tending, and as the table points out, bodily mutilation vary a lot depending on whether they're men's jobs or women's jobs. So there's next a marriage market model. The basic intuition is your value in the market will depend on the investments that you make in human capital in stage one. If there's transactions costs in the marriage market, any exogenous correlation between sex and the type of stage one training you get is going to blow up into an equilibrium with the sexual division of labor. All right. Another paper by Engineer and Welling about the same time generates the imperfect sorting through a certain number of marriages that occur because of true love, and it doesn't matter what your matching human capital endowments look like. So this model doesn't predict how any particular tasks get allocated, just that the coordination requires that women get some kind of pre-marriage training and men get another kind of pre-marriage training. And there's a really rich discussion in the paper. She points out the theory is most compelling in a pre-industrial society in which there's minimal division of labor other than the sexual division of labor, and where tasks are highly labor intensive and require substantial specific investments in human capital beginning at an early age. Okay. Technology and market development change the incentives to specialize. And as she says, one of the most important attributes of the coordination model is this ability to integrate simple economic dynamics with more complex social theories of the sexual division of labor, right? That is, when you get this coordination game that assigns some tasks to women and some tasks to men, then norms develop around that make it seem required as opposed to just efficient. And these norms can serve as a focal point for coordination. And finally, she points out they might cause specialization to persist even when the conditions that drove it have weakened, i.e. our ability to outsource all this stuff increases. So as I pointed out, there were a lot of these papers in the 90s. And I've sort of thought more recently, what was the reason for this fad in papers and why the specific form of this fad? And what I now think is it was really an attempt by economists to carve out a distinctly economic territory within the frame of what was at the time a key social issue of the day. Why was there economic inequality between men and women? And what I can tell you is that economists were always a bit uncomfortable dealing with this whole set of issues, right? Gender and family stuff, it was kind of icky. And economists didn't really, in general, with a few major exceptions, want to deal with it. And I think sociologists have always understood that gender and family issues were part of their scholarly remit. It was a thing that they studied. And for economists, that was not true. And so economists, I can tell you from, post-seminar discussions, always personalize these issues. And this was really distinct when I was working on how do parents behave differently if they have sons versus daughters. The conversations I had in cars on the way to dinner, explaining to me that they really did love their daughters as much as their sons. I mean, and I'm going, it's in the data, dude. It's in the data. I mean, this is, things overlap. I'm not saying anything personally about you and your kids. I'm really not. And so this is the source of my assertion that economists are uncomfortable about these issues. So this, I think, was an obvious tack for economists to take. It made a lot of sense. I mean, you can talk about discrimination, but all social scientists talk about discrimination. That's not just ours. There are obviously important social and cultural forces. With the Hadfield paper starts to discuss way earlier than I thought anybody was discussing that. But economics wasn't ready to go there yet. I think we're ready to go there now. But market equilibrium with frictions, that's us, right? That's what we do. And so that's what we were doing in the 1990s, is producing market equilibrium that generated gender differences. Okay, so the important stuff is, how about the biological story? We need to start with Becker, obviously. I mean, Becker wasn't telling a coordination story. He was telling a biological story. And Becker's story was comparative advantage between the sexes emerges from the physical demands of childbirth and breastfeeding and the complementarities between those required events and other household tasks. And this together leads to a commitment to the care of children by women, right? So the idea is you're at home for a couple of weeks recovering, you're breastfeeding the little one, obviously you may as well be taking care of the other ones and cleaning the house while you're there. And the Beckerian story is that extreme specialization can result from these dynamic investments that follow births, right? Causing, quote, the magnification of small differences in comparative advantage to large differences in earnings, right? So fundamentally, a biological plus human capital, and then we can graft on the early training because you know where you're going to end up, right? Now, it might seem a little odd that, as fertility has dropped and women's labor force participation has increased, that we're still telling this story, but we are. But there's another biological story, and this is my favorite paper of Aloysius's, and is my favorite of the 1990s papers on gender. It was published in the JPE 1998. And the story is, it's all about fecundity, man. It's all about the fact that men can beget babies in their 50s and women can. And this paper spent many years on my graduate reading list. And I'll tell you why I took it off at the end. I still love it, but I had to do it. So here's the setup. The setup is there are no differences between men and women in productivities at home or in the market. So in that sense, it was a 90s paper. And there's no discrimination, right? We have a 2-period model. We have young men and women, and we have old men and women. Between period 1 and 2, you get matched up at the beginning of period 1, and then between period 1 and 2, there's some exogenous probability that you get divorced, all right? The next thing is the only reason to get married is to have children. And women can only bear children in period 1, whereas men can beget children in periods 1 and 2, right? And finally, period 2 wages depend on period 1 labor supply. Okay, so I'm going to take the fastest trip possible through the intuition of this paper. The essence of it is what happens after divorce happens to you. That's totally exogenous. The old women don't remarry because there's no reason for them to remarry because they can't have babies. Old men can remarry, but obviously if they do that, they're only going to marry young women, and they're going to be competing with young men for this fixed group of young women. So young women are really scarce. Old men with higher wages are more likely to get married in that competitive environment. And that means that young men, knowing that they may have a second shot at this marriage and kid thing, will work harder than young women, right? Who have no such prospect, right? And so the result is young married men work and earn more than their wives. Divorced men are more likely to remarry than divorced women, which is true. There are more never married men than never married women, which is true. The average age of first marriage is lower for women than for men, yes. And the variance of completed parity distribution is larger for men than for women because some men never get married and so they don't have any children. And some men marry twice and have 2 children. And so, and this also is factually true, right? And obviously there's a lot more in the paper. So this is a pretty rapid trip through. So why do I like this paper so much? I think the sheer audacity of this exercise is so appealing. This is such an economics paper. And for years, I actually used it as an example for students to say, here's how you set up a model, right? Set up the model with clear intuition, be very precise about how you define things, and just work through its implications, right? And in these days, when it sometimes seems to me that almost none of the graduate students and a lot of the junior faculty can't put up a simple model, I find this very appealing. And the other thing is, it is once again profoundly economic in its clear comfort with very spare models, right? And a willingness to make bold assumptions. And the reason I took it off my reading list is when I moved to Santa Barbara, I was part of a demography initiative, and we have PhD emphases in demography that end up on your PhD diploma. And not economists but many of the other graduate students in the other departments actually want these. And in order to get them, you have to take a graduate course in a discipline other than your own. And I sort of volunteered to have my population economics graduate course available to quantitatively sophisticated students from the other social sciences. And so now I've got non-econ students in my grad class, and there's several of them every year. And a paper that says that we only marry for babies and young women are more attractive to older men because they're breeders. Well, and I've now thought more carefully, and I have anthropologists take my class and they would love it. I mean, because they're the biosocial kind, and they'd have trouble with the algebra, but they'd have an evolutionary story worked out that fits with it immediately. However, the sociologists and the demographers in geography are going to have some difficulty with this. And so I don't make them read it, but I still love it. And now it is newly relevant. And I checked, and there's been a blip in citations to this paper in 2021 because we're working on fecundity. Economists are working on fecundity because we can now do causal inference, right? And we can do causal inference because modern technology extends women's period of fecundity. And so we can look at IVF and changes in the cost of fertility technology as an instrument. And so this paper, the 1998 paper, focuses on men's responses to the incentives provided by differential fecundity. This new work is a little more female focused than that, although it's clearly relevant. And it's also mostly empirical, though not entirely. So just a rapid trip through the new relevance of this. The early studies looked at the empirical impacts of reduced costs for assisted reproductive technology or intra vitro fertilization, which is within that category. Joel Abramovitz used variation in insurance coverage mandates across states in the US and finds that cheaper ART leads to less marriage and childbearing at younger ages and more at older ages. So it's clearly shifting the female life cycle towards marriage and childbearing later. Gershoni and Lowe have a couple of papers that use instead Israel's 1994 adoption of free IVF. And what they find is it increased women's education, right? So extends the period of human capital investment and clearly delayed marriages and first births. Okay, so we're seeing, substantial impacts associated with the expected extension of periods of fecundity. All right. Yep.
You still have the same mechanism, right? So 4-year-old men so
right.
The idea that human capital that we're going to acquire in their 20s is more important than human capital. Because the mechanism should still be there, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are good reasons why you tend to make your major investments in human capital before you start all the other stuff. But yeah, I think and we know that there's a lot more going on here because we know that, 90 plus Rupert Murdoch got, engaged to a woman in her 60s. It doesn't have, IVF isn't going to have any effect on that. So we clearly get these marriage patterns persisting in any case. But it does sort of give us a link though between these timing and work incentive issues and expected periods of childbearing. So. Also a little bit of theory, which is nice. And so Corrine Lowe has a couple of papers out, one forthcoming in the JPE and one forthcoming in Jolly that model sort of women who, first of all, notes that women who delay childbearing to invest intensely in human capital reduce what she calls their reproductive capital. And when reproductive costs are high relative to the gain in income, then you can actually have, and she shows this theoretically and also shows empirically, with some evidence for the 1920 to 1950 birth cohorts that you can have non-assortative matching at the top of the income distribution. So women with sort of postgraduate degrees, right, were more likely to marry lower income men rather than, you know, continue on the positive assortative trajectory. And she shows in the model that as women's income rises and this fecundity constraint eases, complete positive assortative mating is going to return, right? And there's also the paper, one of the papers also has an online experiment that shows that men have a stronger preference for a younger partner, but only if they have no children and are aware of the age fertility trade-off. And I wondered who's not aware of the age fertility trade-off. I mean, but the no children part is I think a relevant, interesting thing. Okay, so let me, I'm going to actually wrap up here pretty quickly. It may be time for us to revisit the modeling side of this, I think, and maybe revisit the work of the 90s, combining the biological and the coordination perspectives, and calling on the fact that we now have fields of cultural and social economics. And so we can maybe attack the kinds of social norms, cultural institutions aspects of it that we didn't feel comfortable dealing with in the 1990s. And I think you can tell a coherent story that begins with, we begin with the extremes of universal male-female households, no longer the case, and limited outsourcing as postulated in Hadfield. And we can get human capital coordination with biological constraints, perhaps suggesting a default equilibrium, which I think is really where we are, in fact. And such an equilibrium can be sustained by norms and institutions as the conditions that required coordination eroded. As we get more single households, we get increasingly intense marketization of that cap H, that household production that had to be produced, and as we move into a period of lower fertility. And then I think we're going to come up with this issue that I've been thinking about some, and that we're just smack in the middle of, which is that this gives rise to group interests in manipulating culture and norms, right? So gender norms have distributional implications, right? If you change the norms about the gender division of labor, right, you make some groups better off and you make some groups worse off. And I think that we now have an economics literature that can embody that. And groups clearly have interests in either working to maintain through political, judicial, social pressures, maintaining or challenging norms, and eventually perhaps our preferences. And I think, you know, that as we look at what happens in judicial institutions, in schools, among employers, and in the media, is sort of what we are currently in the middle of, and should perhaps be able to think more explicitly about as economists. And I'm done. Thanks.
Okay, so there are societies where marital bonds are weaker. So for example, in France, it's a relatively, I understand it's a relatively easy procedure to pax and unpax yourself. Do you see difference? I mean, is the division of labor less stark in such societies? Is there data for that?
Is there data for that? And do I know what it is? Or probably two different questions. I think that the gender division of labor is in fact pretty ubiquitous. I know there are certainly some countries where we know it's more intense than it is in the United States. And I think Southern Europe, that's clearly still true. A lot of parts of Asia, that's still clearly true. France in particular, I don't know. I haven't seen the time allocation data that would let us see that. But there is now tons of time allocation data out there. And, you know, we know that working women do a lot more housework in Spain and Italy than they do in the US, and less than they do in Sweden.
there's also a lot more female mathematicians in France and Italy than there are in the US or Canada. So.
Oh, many complicated roads to that, but that's an interesting one.
So how do we think of non-heterosexual relationships with differential fecundity? This is also something that economists are now, family economists are starting to think about, these almost heterosexual relationships. Do we see patterns, in age differences so a woman could potentially delay fertility with the same-sex partner? How do we make models that match this?
Yeah, I mean, I can't think of anything. I mean, we know something about the gender division of labor and how same-sex households, what same-sex households had to say about that, which is there's a lot less specialization in same-sex households in terms of the work that's getting done. I haven't thought about the fecundity issue. That's I mean, my general understanding is that a lot of same-sex households have had far greater awareness of and use of IVF for obvious reasons. And so we might expect to see differences in the age distribution of fertility. Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I don't think anybody's looked at that.
I was wondering if you've thought a bit about the gender roles in taking care of parents, where, my sense, and actually I kind of remember PSID data, women do more of that as well. Now, maybe that's a follow-on to differences in, kind of careers, basically, perhaps driven by the issues that you're just talking about with fecundity. But it seems to me that we want to be thinking about other differences in gender roles. I think that's a fairly significant one.
Yeah, it certainly is. I mean, I think that it's part of a whole that is, if there is caretaking of humans involved, that women are going to do it. And so I think there's a lot of spillover of the norms yeah, I mean, traditionally women had lower opportunity costs of doing that because they were less likely to be working high paid jobs. But I think it also comes in with the human element here, the caretaking element, that's simply assumed to be a woman's job. My understanding is that in a lot of countries, the gender discrepancies there are not as high as we had thought that they were. And so, especially if there is, if you don't have any daughters, for example, your sons end up doing a lot, in fact. But there certainly is, in the PSID, as you say, and in most other countries, that if we look at just the amount of time devoted to taking care of the elderly, that there's some clear differences. So I once did a paper using Norwegian data looking at the impact of extending formal care for the elderly in some counties in Norway. And the main impact of that was in fact kind of surprising. So there was a significant drop in the sick leave taken by women in their 50s. And clearly what was going on is that the increase in formal care was substituting for emergency care by daughters. And that sick leave had evolved in Norway as an unintended consequence of the expansion of sick leave as sort of an emergency leave, that doctors would certify that you had a bad back or something. And in fact, you were desperately trying to get granddad into some sort of care arrangement that would take care of it. So yeah, care of the elderly is a fascinating topic. And there's a lot more to be said about that, I think. Thank you.
Thank you, Shelly.
Thank you.
Well, and thank you very much to the organizers for having me here, for the incredible honor and privilege that it is to have the chance to speak here. And of course, more profound words of gratitude than I can possibly express to Aloysius for being an extraordinary supervisor, the absolute best mentor I could possibly hope for during my undergrad. But insofar as, well, funny and embarrassing stories are required, I can't possibly just talk about very nice things. So instead, I'll try to give some illustrative stories of what it was like to be Aloysius's undergraduate student last year. And it's sort of difficult to find stories that are not entirely at my expense. So I will try to strike some compromise. And I guess the right story to tell is maybe how I met Aloysius and just before I met Aloysius. And so what one must know is that Toronto faculty tend to walk around the department quoting various pearls of wisdom that Aloysius has imparted to each other. And so I had heard of Aloysius long before I knew who Aloysius was, or long before I met him. So I sort of knew the words of wisdom that were passed around. And then eventually I met Aloysius, and I met Aloysius when I pitched the idea for this paper to him within the structure of a very famous senior thesis course that he teaches for undergrad students. And so I pitched this idea, and I talked for a very, very long time, sort of obnoxiously, telling him about the project that I wanted to do. And eventually it was Aloysius's turn to tell me what he thought of the idea. And he says, "What you are doing," and then he pauses very dramatically, right? So now he's picking his words very, very precisely. And so this is going to be the description of the project. "What you are doing is kind of interesting." And for those of you who have been Aloysius students, I assume you have heard these words many, many times. But when it is the first time you hear these words, you're a little bit heartbroken, because you think, well, if my own supervisor thinks that this is only kind of interesting, maybe it's not such a good project. So, well, I spent my entire senior thesis year hearing at best, okay, or kind of interesting. And so for that entire year, I sort of assumed that this was a very, very bad project, and he was just too nice to tell me. Well, eventually I sort of learned that there was an Aloysius fixed effect, and controlling for that, kind of interesting was actually kind of good. So that was very nice. Okay. And I suppose that the finale to the story is maybe a month or two ago, when I was talking to Aloysius about the various progress that I had pretended that I made. And at the end of that conversation, he says, "You know, what you're doing is interesting." And I thought, but he paused, and there was a moment of silence where I thought, you know, I'd really done something good, but then he continued talking, and he said, "Kind of interesting." And so that is, well, I hope that you too will find this kind of interesting. And the last kind of interesting thing that I will say before I actually share with you the project is maybe actually 1.5 things. The first of which is that, thankfully, this is not my first time presenting this. The first time that I presented this was at an infamous sweat seminar, where I found out that I was presenting this long after Aloysius had signed me up for it. So at least here I've been giving some warning. So I hope that will be nice. But the last thing is that I think I've now joined the ranks of the people who roam the halls of Toronto, or in my case now Paris, happily quoting pearls of wisdom imparted by Aloysius to people who may have never heard of him, but now who must also quote pearls of Aloysius to each other. So that wisdom is now proliferating, and well, I hope that you will find this talk kind of interesting. All right, so this project is about something that happened in Rome. And of course, well, we all sort of have some idea of what Rome is like. That all roads lead to Rome is just one way that we sort of express the fact that Rome is somehow ubiquitous in many facets of culture, economics, just sort of, it's a little bit everywhere. And so, well, perhaps you immediately have in your mind some notion of an Eastern European princess falling in love with an American journalist considering eloping, and falling in love equally with the city in which a very famous movie is set. Perhaps you think of an iconic skyline with tourists roaming little streets and broad avenues, and you really know what Rome is. And perhaps you're maybe thinking of a great capital of an ancient empire. Perhaps you think of the modern city that has become the heir to this great empire. And so you're not entirely surprised that a flourishing metropolis today is this heir to a centuries-long tradition. Except that part actually is surprising, because in between those two flourishing eras was a period during which Rome had been described by contemporaries as a great stable for sheep and a cadaver. And in fact, the map that you see on the screen currently is, well, first of all, it's a map, it's not just a drawing, but second, it's an allegory of Rome as a widow. So the figure in black is Rome portrayed as a grieving widow. Why? because of the Avignon papacy. For a period of about 70 years, from 1307 to 1377, the papacy leaves Rome and heads to the south of France. And there's only one problem. Rome at this time is basically a company town. And when the single company that runs everything leaves, so does the economy. And it's not obvious that even if the papacy comes back, that rebuilding will be very easy. And so on this graph here, I show the kinds of, or the volume of active projects, private investment in real estate that is taking place. And so, okay, luckily we do have some return to very high level of investment. And so you might think, well, this is simply a story of the papacy coming back. So the papacy leaves, comes back, the economy comes back, everything recovers. This is the very natural thing to wonder, except here are the periods of the Avignon papacy. So the first line is the departure of the papacy, the second line is the return, and it doesn't look like very much changes. Okay, so then you might wonder, maybe, well, there was this Black Plague that happened in Europe. Maybe that explains something. Then post-Black Plague, you have a boom in productivity and so forth, and wages go up, and lots of economic historians have written about this. But those are the two small lines in the middle. So yes, it was quite devastating and it was quite important, but that also happens in between. Okay, then there's the Western Schism. This is a period of political turmoil all over Europe. There's several popes at the same time. They happily excommunicate each other. No one knows who the real pope is. Maybe that explains something, right? So people are kind of hesitant to feel like Rome is going to be important again, especially because the other popes are not even in Rome. But then once the Western Schism ends, things should go back to normal. But they still don't. Okay, so then you say, well, eventually there's really an event, right? The death of Pope Eugenio IV, and then there's a real final return to Rome, and that's in 1447. And so that's when the papacy comes back for good. And so you explain the tiny little blip over there. So yes, the final return of the papacy is important, but it's not that important. And one of the reasons it's not that important is because during all this time, ex post, we know what all of these events meant. We know that this was the final return. We know that the schism had ended. We know all of these things. But if you are a Roman at these times, you have no reason to believe a particular return to be the final return. And so none of the conventional explanations, or none of the broad macroeconomic shocks that we would like to point to, do a very good job of explaining the subsequent rise. And so this is an open question in economics, and probably a question that is economically relevant. Well, how was Rome built or rebuilt? And in particular, the hypothesis that I'm going to posit for you today is that most of this has to do with a particular legal reform that was signed in 1480 by Pope Sixtus IV. Now, you might wonder basically whether this trend is driven by something like population. And so I will very quickly show you that basically it doesn't matter how I reweight, by population, by project length, by all sorts of very sophisticated things that I'm very happy to discuss at length later, but I'm starting to get worried about binding time constraints. Basically, this trend is very persistent. You can't get rid of it. And there's a very good possibility that the story I'm going to tell you today is one good way of explaining it. All right, so before we proceed, I think it makes sense to discuss a little bit what exactly this legislation did, and to see if it, in fact, tells a story that you will find compelling. So before 1480, one of the characterizing features of Rome is, again, given that it is run by the papacy, there are a very large number of prelates, people who work for the church, who are religious officials, and who like to take advantage of papal coffers via graft. So this is, essentially, you can think of this as a form of corruption where you're taking advantage of the office that you have. Another peculiarity of being a prelate means that Catholic canon law precludes you from having children. So probably you have children, but they're not legitimate children. And so this means that you cannot have a legitimate heir. And so you can think of this in very simple terms as facing a 100% effective tax rate on inheritance. This is partially used as an anti-corruption measure, with the idea being that if you cannot pass on anything that you own, maybe you can't steal so much. No, you can still steal a good deal, you just can't really invest it, because if you live in a one-period model, you're probably not investing. So this is profoundly unhelpful for the Roman economy. Now, conversely, the laity, so people who do not work for the church, who are not religious officials, face no imposed inheritance constraints, and in fact, basically have no mandatory inheritance tax rate. So they form a natural control group to the degree that the laity and the prelates are similar. And so we can run something like a quasi-natural experiment to basically see if a particular change in legislation is going to affect one of those groups, then maybe we can draw some semi-causal inference, and maybe you'll buy the story. So what exactly does this legislation do? Well, the legislation says that, okay, you still cannot have a legitimate heir, but you can leave your palace, let's say, to your nephew, and your nephew is probably your illegitimate son anyway, so probably you care about him very much. And so for one of these groups, the effective inheritance tax rate goes from 100% to 0%. And well, that's kind of important. It turns out that investment in inheritable real estate projects increases rapidly. People start to care about having a multi-period model, being able to leave something to your children, or at least to your extended family, means that now you're willing to invest. All right. And so what I show on this graph is in the dotted line, this is the very last of the counterfactual explanation. So the real final return to Rome that no one really knew if it was the final return, but we know now. And in the vertical blue line is the legislation. And differentially, the two trends show in red the construction weighted measures for the prelates, and in black for the laity, so the control group. And so there's two things to notice, and this is basically the focus of the paper. The two things to notice are, first, that the return of the papacy to Rome does have an effect, right? So that's the first jump that you see. But importantly, it's not a very large effect, right? The much larger effect happens after the change in legislation. And the second thing to notice is that the laity, so the control group, seems to not respond at all to the macroeconomic shock of the papacy returning, and seems to respond quite significantly to something that presumably does not affect them directly at all. So the story that I have to tell you now is sort of twofold, right? So part of this is the somewhat obvious story that, okay, so the papal bull has a significant effect on the treatment group. And the less obvious story is to suggest what is actually happening with the control group. And so what I'm going to argue happens to the control group, if I have the time for it, is that there's essentially a signaling story, right? So the big problem for the laity is not that they don't have the resources to invest in real estate. The big problem is that they have no idea if the papacy is actually going to stay. And it turns out that maybe after the Pope is able to sign into law this legislation, they take this as a sign of the fact that the papacy really is here to stay. And so what I'm going to try to offer towards the end of the talk is some suggestive evidence that the change that you see for the laity is not just a story of wealth spillovers, but in fact a story of signaling. All right, but before we can get into any of that, I think the important thing is going to be to primarily focus. Yes, please. Yeah. Yes. So essentially, this is partly a story of trickle-down economics in the sense that it is the very, very wealthy who basically create the economy, in the sense that when you want to build a palace, let's say, you need to bring in stonemasons, you need to bring in an industry that basically does not exist in Rome at this time. So one peculiarity of the Roman economy at this time is that actually Rome does not have any industry. The only export Rome has is indulgences, and Rome imports everything else. And this is a serious problem because Rome also has a demographics problem, right? If the only people who are in Rome are Catholic prelates, you don't have a natural birth rate. So one of the things that you desperately need to fix is you need people to come and to be able to find work. And it turns out that construction creates a tremendous amount of work. It also turns out that various popes had tried lots of different things, and none of those things were very effective in either bringing industry or pilgrims who would stay meaningfully, or otherwise encouraging economic growth. So basically one of the problems and one of the reasons previous attempts failed is basically because people do not believe that any of these measures are permanent. And in general, there's a feature of public policy that if people believe something to be transitory, they don't really respond to that change. And so when the changes start to be driven by the private side, right, so by private investment, there's more of a belief that, okay, maybe it does make sense for me as a stonemason, for example, to immigrate to Rome, to stay there permanently because I will have a prolonged contract. This is not just a one-off contract by the church, for example. So it's actually very important for the longevity of economic growth that this comes from the private sector. So the typical way that prelates would help let's say their nephews, would be to try to appoint them, to basically give them a job. Now, there was a problem. If you were working in the church, there's only so high you can rise without being a prelate yourself. So there's a cap to just how much you can help, because otherwise this nephew will also not be able to leave an inheritance. So you are able to help, and were such data to exist, and I'll talk about the data and the complications in a bit, but basically the problem is that you can help, but only in a very limited way. So if you really wanted to help, the best thing that you could do is build something and leave that thing to your family, especially because that becomes something that many generations can invest into over time. This has a cumulative effect, and this is very nice, much better than offering a job that, again, is sort of capped because you cannot progress unless you take various religious vows. And if you take religious vows, then there's no inheritance anyway, so that's not so good. Okay, so I will not dwell very long on the literature review. It suffices to say that the Renaissance, as something that economists have studied, is also a literature to which Aloysius has contributed, because there are no literatures to which he has not contributed. and that this measure in particular, this papal bull, has been the object of study for some historians, but to the best of my knowledge, no economist has ever looked at this and has not considered this as an explanation for what happens in Rome. So essentially the goal of this project is to combine some literatures and to consider some history in an economic context. And this is where we get to the data part, where if we had a slightly more Marxist view of labor in economics, I would just stop here and convince you that I have a really good paper. Unfortunately, or perhaps very fortunately, we do not have such a view of labor. And so I'll actually have to convince you that I have a good paper. But basically, the source of data that I use comes from maps, and from the Nolly map in particular. This is an 18th century map, which is very, very beautiful, and which has been digitized by some historians in the US, such that each landmark in Rome has been populated with a history. So what I do is I manually collect the history of every building in Rome, and I classify each project, each event, who the patrons are, whether they're investing into something inheritable, because obviously the purpose of this legislation is to affect things that are inheritable, whether there's been investment and that sort of thing. So this is a rather time-consuming process. But in this way, we're able to get a very comprehensive source of a data set on various projects of investment that have taken place in Rome. I then pair this with some demographic data in which basically I need to collect some idea of who are the prelates, who is the laity. So for the prelates, I refer to cardinal consistories. This is everyone who's been promoted to a cardinalate or higher, compiled by the Catholic Church for some 600, 700 years. So I collect all of that. I also collect what is essentially a proxy for high-ranking civil servants. So this is an archival source that collects people who occupy very high-ranking civil positions in government. And essentially, you can think of this as being a reasonable proxy for who the highest and most powerful families in the city are. Basically, because if you are very powerful, then presumably you would like to have some leverage in politics. And so various historians have proposed this as a reasonable proxy to a secular elite and a religious elite. And so the graph that we get from plotting these yearly looks something like this, where again, we have the prelates in red, the laity in black. And there's just two things to note. So first, the population of the laity fluctuates, but remains, sorry, the prelates fluctuates, but it remains relatively constant because there's only so many people you need in the church. The number of civil servants is probably going to be somehow endogenous to the various economic conditions of the city, so it grows more rapidly, but there are no serious jumps. It's relatively smooth, so that's very helpful. Just no changes we see are probably going to be driven by serious population swings. But because there are changes, this is something we'll want to control for. So most of the measures I propose are going to be per capita measures. Otherwise, we're really going to be looking at things that aren't very interpretable. All right, so with all of this, we're finally ready to create a panel data set in which each observation is going to be identified by a geographic ID. So this is from the map, right? Just the location of a building, a patron type, because in every building, you can have investments that are performed either by a layman or by a prelate, and by a year, and then I'll narrow the time window for various regressions that we run. But importantly, treatment status follows the patron type. It does not follow the building. And so what this means is that I have to create dummy observations for each building. In each year is going to appear twice, once for each patron type. And then I'm going to assign 0 to the missing values because this suggests that there's no active project at this time. And so we're going to have a balanced panel with which we can finally run some quantitative analysis. And the quantitative analysis that we run is the following. So in this graph, I present the coefficients from a difference in difference estimate of investment rates per capita. And so this graph is with the full controls, with the full fixed effects and all the clustering and lots of very fancy econometric techniques. The graph stays basically exactly the same if you take out all of those things. So I will not present that part, but it's a very robust finding. And so as you can tell, essentially the difference between lay and prelate investment increases markedly and stays that way for a period of, if you're in the back and you can't see, the red vertical line is at 1480, the graph cuts off at 1600. I also repeat this for a much smaller sample in case you're worried about various macro shocks that take place before or after. It stays exactly the same. And so essentially, okay, the skyrocketing red line that we saw, yes, the papal bull changes something. It changes the incentives for the laity for the prelates to invest. Okay, now that was sort of the extensive margin. Perhaps you're also interested in the intensive margin, right? Can we construct something like a measure of productivity? And so here, what I propose is instead of looking just at the per capita, we also weight projects uniformly by their project length to basically see what fraction of a project is going to be completed in a given year. And I'll run the same regression with all the same controls, but conditional on there actually being a project. So conditional on there being a project, which fraction of a project is being completed. And so it's again the same difference between prelates and the laity. And again, we have a remarkably consistent trend afterwards. So essentially, you can think of this as some measure of intensive productivity. The laity is going to be more productive also. Now, this is where we get to maybe the less important result, but I think the more interesting story. And this is, okay, but why is the laity responding, right? So they're not the beneficiaries of a tax cut. If you're worried about something like finite resources and needing to share, you might even expect some kind of substitution effect, right? Why is it that after one group starts building, so does the other? So maybe one of the obvious stories would be something about general wealth spillovers. One group is building, so does the other, but I don't think it's quite so obvious. And the way that I would like to ask you to think about this is that the decision to build is basically going to be a function of wanting to build something and being able to build something. So if people's decision to build is changing, well, this could be one of two margins. Maybe it's both, right? So maybe your incentives to build are changing. Maybe something about your budget constraint is changing. Now, the incentives would be driven by a signaling story. Essentially, this suggests that you kind of always genuinely want to build something. And there's a number of economic historians who suggest that investment in real estate is the investment of choice. This is something for which people have very inelastic demand. But essentially, you think that if the papacy is not going to stick around, there's no real purpose for you to build. Okay. The other story is simply wealth effects. If some people are building, maybe costs are lower, right? So maybe builders start to come in from Lombardy, and now it's much cheaper for me to hire the guy who's working across the street than to hire the guy who's half a country away. Okay, maybe risk is lower, various financial constraints come into play, maybe borrowing is now easier because everyone is doing this. So there's lots of financial mechanisms that you can consider, especially if you're a finance student, which clearly I should be able to come up with lots of stories for this, but I can't. And so instead, the story that I prefer is the incentive story. But it's going to be very difficult to disentangle these, even with very good contemporary data. These are kind of difficult to disentangle because both mechanisms kind of come down to the existence of strategic complementarities. So it'll be quite tricky to properly disentangle. So the best I can do is provide some kind of suggestive evidence, where the idea is going to be to play on the fact that wealth effects would have to affect the ambition of the project, but perhaps less the decision to build in the first place. Right, so just how much you build is going to be a function of the wealth that you have, but probably not the decision to build in the first place. Okay, so the source of the suggestive evidence will be if we can examine the changes in the trajectories of project length. And the idea will be if the trajectory of the project length appears to be unchanged by the papal bull or is not changing very much, then maybe that will suggest that there is some kind of signaling channel that is affecting people's decision to build, but not affecting quite so much how much they're building, to the degree that you can treat the length of a project as a proxy for its ambition. Okay, so if we look at these measures, here I plot the change in project length for both the laity and the prelates. So a reminder, this is the treatment group, this is the control group, with two vertical cutoffs, but the reference category is always the same. It's always just before the papal bull. And then the other vertical line is, again, the best counterfactual we have, which is the real de facto return to Rome. And so what you see for the laity, which is the group here of interest, is that, okay, so project lengths are changing, but there does not seem to be a point of inflection anywhere around the introduction of the papal bull. So this is some suggestive evidence that if we look at all projects, maybe whatever trend is driving this is not really changing at around the time of the papal bull. Conversely, the prelates offer a very nice comparative because, okay, well, very clearly the project lengths do change and they change markedly and just around that. So there's much more of an effect, of a wealth effect for one group than for the other, right? So the budget constraints really are changing in one case, but maybe not so much for the other. Now you might wonder here if essentially this could be driven by outlier projects that are terribly, terribly long. And so what I do is I basically cut the data and I get rid of all projects that are going to be over 50 years in length, saying that basically if you have a project that is this long, maybe this is some situation in which you've run out of funding and so your grandchild is going to finish this project and not you. And so maybe these are not very good projects to consider within a consideration of project length. So I say, we'll get rid of all the long projects and now we'll run the same regressions and we'll ask basically if the new projects are going to be longer than the old projects, which would be a proxy for ambition, right? So conditional on having only short projects, if you're building for slightly longer, you're willing to take more risk, right? So this is not necessarily a feature of you spending more money because it sort of depends on what you do. But if you're willing to sign up for a longer project, you understand that you're taking greater risk temporally. Okay, so what do we see for the laity? Well, we do see people getting more ambitious if you buy that proxy, but it looks like the change for ambition actually happens around the real return to Rome. It does not happen around 1480. Now, the only reason that the coefficients start to get significant and positive or different from zero is because I use 1470 as the reference category. If I were to use 1430, so just before the return to Rome, that would put all of this as significant. Now, conversely, you see that for the prelates, this doesn't really happen, right? So it doesn't look like projects get all that much more ambitious, conditional on having small projects as a wealth effect for one group, but for the laity, they do, and they happen to get more ambitious or more, let's say, risk tolerant around the macroeconomic shock. So the macroeconomic shock does affect the wealth constraints. So this is actually sort of what you should expect, right? There is a macroeconomic shock, that is the return of the papacy to Rome. And the macroeconomic shock affects the ambition of projects, but it does not affect people's willingness to build those projects in the first place. The willingness to build the projects in the first place is an incentive problem, and the incentives get resolved just around 1480. So this is not perfect evidence. I think it would be very, very difficult, conditional on wanting to use historical data to find perfect evidence, but I think this offers some suggestion of what's taking place. And the last thing that it might make sense to look at is, well, I told you about those outlier projects, right? Projects that are probably indicative of some kind of failure. What actually happens to those? And while for the prelates, so the treatment group, I don't observe any significant changes, for the laity, there's something very interesting. And it turns out that just after the legislation, the very, very long projects begin to drop out. So conditional on having a very long project in the past, the next project that you have is probably going to be a short one. What this suggests is probably that you are not running out of funds anymore. So your willingness to complete projects is higher. Maybe you have greater confidence in what is taking place. But again, all of this is somewhat suggestive evidence. I think the best that we can do in general with economic history is to provide something quite illustrative, but I think that the story that this tells is a fairly compelling one. And the story that this tells is basically that, well, it does turn out that people respond to incentives. Turns out that people need to have faith in the future of the city in which they live in order to invest in it. And it turns out also that believing that the papacy has come back for good affects both groups, even the group that is not the direct beneficiary of the tax cut. And it affects it in a more meaningful way than mere wealth spillover effects would suggest. And so by way of conclusion, I thought I would share with you a poem that I think is really quite beautiful, but I will also take this opportunity to suggest that one thing that economic history can do for us that often we cannot do, even when we have much better data on contemporary events, is in the story that it tells. And so the next time that you are in Rome, the next time that you're watching a Roman holiday or roaming the streets of Rome yourself, and you pause to think, okay, well, where did this beautiful building come from? Or how do cities get built? You'll remember that sometimes it's a simple piece of legislation that changes fundamentally the way that people have a relationship with their city. And perhaps that changing relationship that you have with the city can give you another beautiful, flourishing metropolis as we see with Rome. Thank you very much.
Very interesting. I was just curious, like, do you observe the kind of projects or like for each of the building? Like, was it commercial? Was it kind of like a state building, or was it kind of like homes? Or like, I think it'd be interesting to also explore like the exact type of projects being built, and just curious about that. Yeah.
So all of the projects here presented are specifically inheritable investment into real estate. So this is not the construction of businesses. This is specifically the construction of basically, you can think of these as houses, but as fabulously wealthy houses. So essentially these are palaces, mansions, this sort of thing. So this is very strictly investment into private real estate. I do also have data on the other kinds of projects that people may have. And so one thing that I'm hoping to work on is to process the data, for example, on investment in churches, because the suggestion there would be that once you have a changing relationship with the city, suddenly you think that you're going to stay here for several generations. Now you also care about things like patronage. And so you start to care about investing in the church in the neighborhood so that you can put your name on that church and all sorts of nice things follow from that. And so there's good evidence to suggest basically that it's not just private investment that benefits from this, but conditional on there being private investment, various kinds of patronage and public investment benefits as well. So that would be something that I would hope to include as a next step. But indeed, it's for now, this is just private investment.
Very interesting. Thank you.
Thank you.
So usually the effects depend on what people's perception is about the persistence of this change. So if they imagine that this new decision is going to be around for a long time or forever, I guess that was the assumption here. But I think these are turbulent times, so I guess you never know. And one thing I can think of that would be an indicator how persistent this is when the new pope appears. I'm not sure how many years later that is, but let's say if the new pope comes and nothing is changed for 5-10 years, at that point you would, I think, reasonably assume, okay, that's a permanent change.
Yes.
So in many ways, I would expect even a bigger effect, perhaps
Yes.
some years later when I'm not sure exactly when is the new pope appears, and
So
around that
the next
time.
pope is elected in 1494.
Okay.
And so in 14, that puts you right here. So that's actually just about where the effects start to become statistically significant. So that's very compelling.
I see. Okay. Thanks.
Thanks. I thought this was kind of interesting. I was.
Thank you.
So I was wondering. Okay, so you have this initial effect on laity, who basically are able to give. Sorry, on the prelates are able to give wealth to laity. I was wondering if you're able to track who those people are who benefit from it, to see if some of the delayed effects might be from the beneficiaries themselves, that maybe suddenly they have a lot of wealth and that's why they're able to build more later.
Yes. So that is an avenue that I really hoped to pursue. And I'll tell you what I tried to do. And then if you have a better idea for how to do this, please tell me. So what I hoped to do was essentially to follow the families, right? And to typically a patron will only appear once in my data set because you're not really going to build multiple palaces in your lifetime, but maybe families appear multiple times. And the problem is that through marriage, families can get quite large and they don't have consistent spellings and they don't have the same name, right? So if your sister gets married, then I mean, it's still the same family, but maybe it's not going to be the same last name anymore. And so that's quite complicated. So with the generosity of the department, I actually went to the State Archive in Rome and I tried to follow the notaries, basically, who would have been the ones writing up this stuff. But it turns out that in part because of the sack of Rome, in part because Rome is an interesting place, archives are not very helpful for 15th century evidence. If you want very good and detailed household finance type stuff, you have to be looking at 17th century, 18th century. But as an undergrad student, clearly I did not know about these constraints. So either you have to move to Florence or you have to look at a later time period. So all of my attempts of identifying more locally have not been very good. So the best I could do is basically drop a whole bunch of things from the sample and then say conditional on having something good in the sample, here's what I get. But then I'm worried a little bit about selection problems there. So I think what you're saying is very, very compelling. Well, the other option is to go the pure history route and to point to anecdotal evidence, but probably economists are not going to find that terribly convincing.
So I had actually the same question originally. I do think that there are transfers of bishopries at that point. So you could try, it's not clear to me that the transfer is from prelate to laity, because in some cases you were also transferring your bishop title to your heir. So in that case, it's prelate to prelate, right? The transmission might not involve laity. So if you could get just a sense of that fraction, you might be able to rule out this channel if it's not big. And again, that would be something that the church records would be more likely to help you than the household family finance, which are potentially more complicated to get. And my second question was more, could we use, so this is something that was implemented not just in Rome, but in all the Catholic Church. And so this changed the incentives, for example, of becoming a prelate or of rising in the hierarchy. So could we do other things than just look at Rome with that shock? And have you thought of anything?
Yeah,
Given that you're a PhD student, I'm trying to give further ideas.
Thank you very much. So the two things I can say on that front are that definitely this changes the incentives. And so Joe Connors, for example, points out in a few historical pieces that by the time that we get to the mid to late 16th century, the kinds of people who are becoming very high-ranking ecclesiastical officials is somehow changing. So this is one of the reasons that I rerun all of the same regressions with a much tighter window, because I want to abstract from those things, because it also takes you time to rise in the ranks. And the idea basically is that it becomes increasingly common for families that have two sons to send one into government and one into the church for precisely this reason. And so in order to abstract from those changes, that's why I shrink the window. But the idea there is that incentives definitely change, and we see them, and there's micro-historical accounts of the fact that this changes. As for the other question of comparing to other cities, this gets a little bit complicated for a couple of reasons. First, Rome is very, very particular in the way that the city operates. And so the natural comparisons, let's say that we would point to, so places like Florence or something, in historical terms are very, very poor comparisons just because of how different the cities are. So having talked to a couple of historians about this, the natural comparative city is London, but no one is ever going to buy a London comparison, right? Because you have all of these Italian cities. So that's tricky. The other reason that it's tricky is because if you hope to see a similar effect, you would actually have to see two distinct classes that exist in equally prevalent ways. And it turns out that high-ranking ecclesiastical officials tend to go to Rome. Now, the one piece of suggestive evidence that I can provide is that I observe where the high-ranking ecclesiastical officials tend to live. And it turns out that they start to migrate more towards Rome. So the number of cardinals who live outside of Rome starts to kind of shrink. But this is a little bit difficult to make a causal claim about, because maybe they're moving specifically because things are getting better and not with the hope of things getting better, if that makes sense. And so again, this is sort of illustrative. I think it helps tell the story, but also the number of cardinals who live outside of Rome is just not that high in general. Thank you very much.
Great, thanks very much. It's really great to be here to celebrate Aloysius's career. I thought I would talk a little bit about the Columbia days, and maybe the first thing I'd have to say is I'm somehow pretty surprised to find myself here. It doesn't seem so long ago that Aloysius suddenly just kind of showed up at my door. As many of you know that we were incoming assistant professors at Columbia in the fall of 1980. And I think it was in the summer before classes started. And so Aloysius comes in. We never met, hadn't met before. And he's wearing this t-shirt, I think shorts, but I'm not sure. And I think in those few minutes, I discovered a few things. I would say, just as a preface, that Costas has, I keep saying Costas, one of my other favorite colleagues, Costas McGeer, and co-authors. Aloysius has a work on how early work, like I think the draft paper was the importance of first impressions, has on your subsequent career. And I can tell you that at least as of the summer of 1980, I don't think Aloysius had mastered how you handle first impressions. So some of the things that endear him to us, his informality, his uncensored nature, and his lack of caring about any kind of academic politics were all very much on display during all the time that we were at Columbia. But there were a lot of other things that were on display as well. I think it's all we already went over. The breadth of Aloysius's contributions. He actually knew a lot of macro. I think he probably still does. Actually knew a lot of econometrics. He has a pretty heavily cited, one heavily cited paper, a couple actually that are on econometric methods. Personnel economics is one of his main areas that have work on the what firms do, and also personnel economics. His job market paper, which is in Econometrica, is on occupational choice and really the dynamics of markets for specific occupations. It was about lawyers, and kind of underlying the range of substantive questions is, I think, his breadth as an economist. He's a really big toolkit. I think Aloysius at his heart is really an applied theorist. That's the way he kind of views the world. It's not first numbers. It's actually first kind of what's going on, and then backing it up with empirical work. But then the other side actually is creativity in sort of bringing theory to the data and providing kind of credible evidence to back up his stories. People have mentioned about the seminars, and I have to say that it's not something that he didn't become more direct. I think with age, it was certainly there from the beginning. I think including in our first meeting, I think he was asking about my job market paper. But the thing about the questions is, it was always, like when he said, "I don't understand," I can't quite do it with Aloysius's accent. He actually meant, "I don't understand, and I really want to." And the questions were always constructive. Aloysius is a kind, constructive colleague. The other characteristic I think it's about this is curiosity, and I think that's the most important thing in having kind of a staying productive, I think, in academia, is that you're really driven by interest in the questions. And that, I think, Aloysius has in spades. I can kind of envision, kind of him as a little boy, probably pestering his parents, one question after another. "I don't understand." He's still doing this now. Last night, again, I'm still a little trying to wrap my head around the idea of Aloysius retiring. I once told somebody who asked me, I think it was about whether Aloysius would kind of keep working. It was if somebody was thinking about recruiting him. And I said, well, he'll die with his boots on, meaning he would go to the grave proving another theorem. So, well, the thing is, he did tell me about his project on, basically started by asking me whether I knew what managers did and I had to admit I didn't, and what workers did. But that's what he's working on now. And I think something great will probably come out of it. When I was at Columbia, I was having a conversation with one of our colleagues, and we were lucky. We had actually a really great set of junior colleagues there. I think it was Martin Osborne, but I'm not sure. And I think we were talking about Aloysius, and I said, well, Aloysius is my closest colleague. And I think then Martin said, well, he's my closest colleague. And then I think we just said, well, he's everyone's closest colleague. And again, it was because of his, I think his breadth and curiosity. Okay, so let me turn to the paper, and I've now added a second rule about when you want to give talks. It's always been, you don't want to give talks during the job market season, because essentially every single job market candidate will show you up. Now I've realized you should never give a talk after someone with a great undergraduate thesis gives a presentation. So this is a first for me. You can see my co-authors, Daniel Giraldo Paez, Disa Hinsjo, and Yvonne Vidangos. And there's a disclaimer that the Federal Reserve Board, this isn't their opinion. Okay, so the background. Labor and marriage markets jointly determine lifetime family income that a person gets, which means that you need a model of labor market behavior, and you need a model of marriage to understand how permanent differences across people and shocks like wage shocks are going to drive the wages, hours, marriage, and family income dynamics, and how they contribute, or how they, to what extent do they determine inequality in lifetime family income. Now, these processes differ by gender, and changes in those differences, changes in the labor market, marriage market, gender norms are going to lead to differences by cohort. And that's basically what the paper is about. So we build on a prior paper in which what we do is we've modified the model in that paper to come up with a birth cohort specific model of the earnings process, marriage, marital sorting, and so on. And we extended the data to 2019. It's the panel study of income dynamics. So we then use the model to simulate earnings, marriage, and family income over a lifetime by gender and cohort. So this lets us study cohort differences in the effects of education, permanent heterogeneity, labor market shocks, marital histories, and also look at gender and cohort specific decompositions of the sources of variation in family income. And we also use the model to study the extent to which education and permanent wage differences in particular, but some other things, work through what we call the marriage channel, that is, through their effects on transitions in and out of marriage, and also through marital sorting. And again, we'll look at how those things have changed over time. So just quickly on motivating facts about cohort differences and gender differences. So there's a large literature, I think some of the prominent papers are at the top there, that's documented that the labor market behavior and fertility of women has changed dramatically over the 20th century. We've seen plenty of documentation just in the conference. Female labor force attachment has increased, especially for married women. Female labor force attachment for men has fallen to some degree, not dramatically, but some. Female education levels have risen dramatically relative to men, or now exceed men by a fair amount for the most recent cohorts. The gender gap in wage levels has narrowed, conditional on education. And the female share of family earnings among married couples has risen substantially. And finally, the drop in marriage and fertility rates implies that gender differences in labor market behavior within marriage matters less for income that an individual experiences over their lifetime than before. So this is the kind of motivation for this paper. Because of these changes, we would expect generational change in the role of marriage and in partner characteristics, in earnings and family income dynamics, and in the importance of own permanent characteristics, spouse characteristics, labor market shocks for lifetime earnings and family income. And in particular, we would expect some convergence between men and women in dynamics and in the distribution, determinants of the distribution. Okay, so very quickly, because I'm down to 29 minutes. There's a vast literature in labor economics and demography that this paper is building on, because essentially we have a model of earnings, so then that's equation, labor supply, wages, and so on, and also children and labor market outcomes. There's the literature on marriage formation and sorting, models with no search, which I think of Gary Becker. Chu and Siow is probably the workhorse model now in this strand of the literature, and then papers with search and some empirical papers at the bottom. Then there's substantial literature on marital sorting and inequality. And again, here, I think an early paper by Catherine Shaw and then a number of other prominent papers. And then finally, a big literature on earnings dynamics and inequality which we don't directly address in this paper. Okay, so, and then just the connection, I've already basically said what it is to this earlier paper. Basically, I think we basically put together a model of the earnings process, marital formation and dissolution, marital sorting and fertility into a model of income dynamics and distribution. And we study the effects of shocks like divorce, a wage shock, unemployment shock for men and women separately. And then we do a decomposition of the average annual income that individuals get between age 25 and 55. And we found strong differences by gender in the role of marriage and marital sorting. For women, who the women marry was much more important for their family income than for men. Okay, so what we do here is we basically took that framework, extended it to study birth cohort differences by gender, and that's basically what the paper's about. Very quickly on the data, it's pretty familiar data source. So it's the 1960, we use the PSID from 1969 to 2019. And really the big channel for a paper that's studying dynamics is that the PSID went to every other year interviewing after 1997. So we just deal with that as best we can. I also want to emphasize that marriage is, when I say marriage, I mean marriage plus cohabitation, using the rules in the PSID for defining that. And so some of the changes in marriage, what the marriage processes that we're seeing are partly reflecting actually differences in, how in fact cohabitation affects persistence in marriage. We haven't tried to sort that out. The family is the family that an individual is observing living with at the survey date. And the sample is of people who are, I've forgotten the new terminology in the PSID, but the older terminology was heads and wives. I think they've now gone to a more neutral, gender neutral term. I've just forgotten what it is. There's a bunch of issues with the data that I really don't have time, to go into. But one thing we are using is retrospective reports of annual hours and earnings that give us an annual measure. That turned out to appear to be the best option. But let me move on. Other than to say that when I use the term unemployment, it means you had positive hours of work during the year and you had at least some hours of unemployment. If you were unemployed the whole year, we're actually treating you as if you weren't in the labor force. So the key distinction is, did you work any hours at all? And then if you did you have some unemployment? Okay, so just very briefly about estimation. We don't estimate, this is far from the kind of elegant model that Aloysius has given us. We have lots of equations, lots of parameters, and we estimate them. For almost all of them are estimated separately using a variety of techniques depending upon the nature of the model. We mostly abstract from correlated unobserved heterogeneity across different equations. And as some of the estimation methods we're using imply, given the specification, that there's going to be some bias. Okay, briefly about the model. It has six parts. There's the joint distribution, there's initial conditions, which is the joint distribution of employment, marital status, and number of children when you're at age 25, conditional on your education, birth cohort groupings, and gender. Then there's a model of earnings, a model of marital transitions, model of marital sorting, a simple model of fertility after age 25, a model of unearned income, and then finally family income is just earnings plus spouse's earnings if you're married, plus unearned income. So briefly about the earnings model, it consists of basically a three-state dynamic model of labor market transitions with unobserved heterogeneity in it. Then there's equations for wages, equations for hours, conditional unemployment status, and then just the accounting relationship, between with earnings as a function of hours and wages. So in the earnings model, most equations include education interacted with a potential experience polynomial or with age and a cubic time trend. We separately estimate for men and women. For women, most parameters depend on marital status. For the men, we typically just have an intercept shift for marriage. We have birth cohort polynomials that are main effects. And then we have interactions of either birth cohort, sometimes birth cohort squared, with selected variables. And we basically made decisions based on significance tests and the AIC criteria, and hopefully not too much data mining. I think I've already said enough. I think in the interest of time, I've already kind of verbally described this slide. For annual hours, so again, hours depend on employment status, the wage rate, age, education. We have permanent heterogeneity across people, which is actually fairly important. Then there's an autoregressive error component and an IID error term. For women, it's the same as men, except we also include number of children at different ages. And for married women, we include spouse's wage, which comes in negative, and unemployment status, which comes in positive. Okay. Oops. So marriage transitions, we have a probit model for transitions into marriage. So it's the people who are single, and that depends on your own wage rate, your employment status, children. We have an index of young children. I think that's all that we included in the model after having looked a bit, and then age and education, and those are gender-specific equations. Marriage continuation depends on education, wages of both the man and woman, mismatch on wages, age, and education, children, marriage duration, and then we have a marriage-specific unobserved match component, but we don't have any process that's fixed, and then there's just IID shocks that affect whether there's a divorce. So for marital sorting, we need to actually model the initial values of all the spouse variables to be able to simulate this model. So we model spouse's age, education, and labor force status as gender-specific functions of the sample members' variables. In the case of spouse's education, we do allow sorting to change with birth cohort. And spouse's age, I think the effective age also depends on birth cohort and birth cohort squared. We have sorting on both the permanent component of the hourly wage rate and the autoregressive component. And they're separate parameters pre-1962 and 1962 or later. We don't find much of a change in those sorting. And the coefficients are, I just checked it twice this morning. Now I bet I'll still get it mixed up. The coefficient is smaller for men. It's about 0.3. So if the man's permanent wage goes up by a unit, the spouse goes up by 0.3, and for the women, it's about 0.38. So there's a fairly big link in these components, and we constrain the factor loadings to be the same for both components of the wage. Here's the model, but I'm going to just go past this slide. Okay, non-labor income. We basically have a regression model for non-labor income as a function of a bunch of stuff: education, age, children, work hours, employment status, and the wage rate. And there are different equations depending on whether there was a marital transition or not, with the idea that whether wealth carries over or not is unclear. And there's some issues with estimation that I won't spend much time on, or any time on. Okay, so I mentioned the initial conditions for employment, marriage, and children. The first period of the model corresponds to age 25 of the PSID sample member, not the spouse. So spouses' ages can be younger than that. I think I already described that we have this joint distribution. Okay, so the fit of the model is mixed. And sometimes mixed means the authors think it's actually pretty good, and usually the referees think it's maybe not so good. What we do, there's a lot in the, we just finished the initial draft of the paper the other day. I'd say that typically for most of the means and standard deviations, we do pretty well. And many of the profiles, the age profiles, fit pretty well. But there's for some of that, we do the fits by cohort. And in some cases where the marriage rate is off, the average earnings is off by, more than I would like. It's hard to know, whether it matters much for what I'm gonna tell you. Persistence is understated for hours, earnings, and family income. And as a result, we might be understating to some degree the importance of shocks in this model, in the decompositions I'll show you. Okay, so let me now talk a bit about, show you a few of the estimates of some of the effects of some of the shocks. And just very briefly, we're using a pretty standard impulse response methodology. What we do, but it might help for me to say a little bit about it. So for each sample member in a cohort, we simulate 500 lives for them, and we do it twice. So the base case is we just simulate a lifetime for them and keep track of all their data, marriage, past, and so on. And then we impose a shock at age 34 for all individuals of a particular gender marital status. For example, a single person who suddenly is, we make unemployed. Or I'm going to show you married people who we then make divorced. Then after the shock, then the variables evolve according to the model. So some of the people get divorced and get remarried. And some of the people who we didn't shock in the basic path, they get divorced. Okay, and then I'm going to show you the difference between the counterfactual path and the base path. And you'll kind of see confidence interval estimates. Those are all based on bootstrapping everything. Okay, so let's look at the effects of marriage and divorce, and I'll start with divorce. And what I want to kind of highlight for you is change across cohorts. And so I think the first things are pretty familiar given the vast literature on changes in female labor force, labor market behavior. So on the left, you can see the cohort from the pre-baby boom cohort, 35 to 44. And the orange line is the log wage, the green is log hours, and then here we have log earnings. And so after the divorce, there's this big increase in logs in the earnings of these women. It goes up above an increase of above 0.7. And most of it is hours, and then you do see some increase in wages. This gets much smaller for the baby boom. And the main change is married women in the baby boom worked much more than in this pre-cohort. And so their earnings, there is a big labor supply response, but it's about half as big as it was in the prior cohort. And the fact that these women were working before is going to be saying something about, kind of what happens. Married women are working is going to say something about what happens to the men in the later cohorts. And then this continues to the 67 to 80 cohort. So the magnitudes are dropping steadily because married women, are working. Here's the effect of divorce on log family income per adult equivalent. So this is you can see that it's sort of big drop of around minus 0.75 for the pre-baby boom cohort. And underlying that is this massive drop in log family earnings. So the man was earning contributing most of the earnings. I think it was something like 82%, if I remember correctly, 83% for this cohort in our data. And then after the divorce, those earnings are gone. So there's the effect on family income per adult equivalent is smaller for the baby boom. It's still big. You see there's a bigger reduction in the drop in family earnings. And then that drop in family earnings goes down some more, but we don't get any further. In fact, it goes up slightly. This negative impact of divorce goes up slightly for the most recent cohort. So for men, what you have to remember, the scales are different. So this is 0, that's minus 0.05, that's minus 0.1. So the men, there's a small negative effect on the earnings of men. That's the red line. It's minus 0.08. And then it's, goes back up to about 0.05. And the effects, though, become somewhat more negative across cohorts. So the men now, after a divorce, there's more of a reduction for them. And it's mostly a change in hours. It's not so much the wage dynamics. Yes. So I'm not an expert on that, and we haven't looked, but I'm pretty sure that there was. That should be showing up to some in the non-labor income, and so it may be playing a role in the family. And you're wondering whether this the labor supply response to? Yeah, I don't know. That's a good question. Okay. All right. So here's what happens to the men. In the early cohort, their log family income per adult equivalent actually goes up a little bit because they've lost an adult. The way we're doing this, we're actually acting as though the men are we're acting as though they're still living with their biological children. So it's probably a little bit conservative. And what you can see, though, is, and you see log family earnings for the men drops by about minus 0.3. As we go, though, to the later cohorts, the men, even the baby boom, there's a small negative drop, and family earnings are dropping more. When we get to the 67 to 80, well, they have a drop of about minus 0.18. And so what's happening now is for men, they're losing their partner's earnings, and that's becoming more consequential. Okay, so this graph tries to look at to what extent is sorting versus what we call the marriage channel influence the effects of divorce. So, and the bottom line, maybe I won't take the time. Let me just say a bit about what I mean by marriage channel. What we do is we replace our equations for marriage transitions with equations that just depend upon age and birth cohort. That's it. And for marital sorting, we replace the equations for marriage to equations in which your partner's education just depends on, I think, your birth cohort, and maybe age. I can't remember now. And so we then simulate the model where we use these substitute equations and look at the differences. So the black line is basically, it's the baseline simulation that I showed you. Why don't we go over here first? And then what you can see is this is when the light gray line, long dash, is when we shut off sorting. That doesn't make any difference. The marriage channel does make a difference. The losses are less severe if we get rid of the marriage channel. And we think the main reason is basically, once we do that, more of the women who we didn't divorce, they get divorced because there's no longer duration dependence. We don't have heterogeneity anymore. And we think that that's what's going on. So anyway, let me move on. There's not a big change actually in this for the women in the role of these channels. And for the men, who you can see now, here's their losses. It's, again, minus 0.19. For the most recent cohort, about half of it is sorting. When we get rid of sorting, they lose the reduction. Sorry, not half of it, but you can see that the reduction is reduced partly by from the marriage channel. And then sorting is the other half. Okay. Here's the marriage shock is it's not completely it's partly symmetric almost by construction because we don't distinguish between you're only either single or you're married cohabiting. We don't have people who were previously married, and that might change things. So you can see that for these women, when they get married, log family income per adult equivalent goes up by quite a bit, not as much though as for the divorce going the other way. And you can see that log family earnings goes up by a lot. What's interesting is that log family earnings, it actually goes up by even more for the later cohort. And that's partly because these women continue to work. So after marriage, they're still working. And so you get this much higher and higher level of bigger increase in family earnings, even for the most recent cohort. Okay, I'm going to skip this. Okay, let me just say something about housework, because I think you've already been thinking, well, all we're looking here is at market measures of income. So and the men after the divorce, they're losing more housework than their partners were doing more of the work. So we valued household work hours at the 25th percentile of the female wage distribution. It's not clear what the right value should have been. In our prior paper, we provided a regression analysis that suggested that the effect of marriage on access to partners' home production narrows the gender gap in material gain for marriage by about a third. So it's actually quantitatively a fairly significant, and it would be bigger if we used a bigger wage to do the valuation. We've looked at this, we still have more work to do, but it doesn't look like a big change across cohorts. And we need to do some more work on that, but it didn't. I was actually expecting to see a bigger change, and we didn't. Okay, so the gender gap in the response of family income per adult equivalent to unemployment and wage shocks has declined, but it's still large. So as women became more committed to the labor market, unemployment shocks started becoming more consequential, and it's quite clear in the data. And that's also true of wage shocks. I think I'm going to just skip fertility shocks. I might come back to it. Well, we'll see. Because I think this is the only thing that maybe is a little bit unusual is the looking at family income per adult equivalent from the point of view of the person, and then tracking them through marriages. So here's for single women and who have a birth, and here's their family income per adult equivalent. So it goes down and then sort of recovers. If you go to the most recent cohort, initially I was surprised to see, well, it's almost the same. And what's going on here is the women are working more after the child, but what's happened is the effect of having a child on marriage goes way down. So it's much lower. The effect of having a child for this cohort on marriage is declined quite a bit. So as a result, family income per adult equivalent tends to go up with marriage, and it's just really being affected here just by the child. Okay. This slide, I'm just going to not talk you through. What we're trying to do here is look at the earnings, the family income per adult equivalent gap between college and high school educated women. And the graph is showing you the age profiles of that for the three cohorts. And you can see this is the differential. This is what you get if there was no marriage channel and no sorting. And for that cohort, the sorting channel is a huge piece of the education differential. And it's still big for the more recent cohort, but it's not as big as it was. And the marriage channel is starting to show up as playing a significant role. For the men, the importance of sorting is actually, this is the line, goes from kind of a moderate contribution to something much bigger, and sorting the marriage channel or become a much bigger part of the return for men for the most recent cohort. Okay, so I'm going to skip these because I only have time really to tell you a bit about our variance decompositions. And I won't tell you how we did them, other than what we did is essentially did simulations where we shut off one source of variation at a time and then recompute the variance. And then we figured out how much did it go down, and then that's the contribution. These don't actually have to add up to 100. Okay, so let me just tell you that. So the kind of shades of kind of red brown are the results for women, and from left to right, it's the pre-baby boom, where this is it, and the pre-baby boom. The middle was the baby boom, And then the kind of pink color is the more recent. And the source here is education. So the sources are at the bottom. And for men, the columns are to the right. So you can see there's this big role for education in that pre-baby boom cohort for both men and women. But and there was sort of a significant difference in the contributions, but that difference is almost gone for the most recent cohort. It's down to 31.1% for women, and up and down, but it's down to 31.1 for the men. Here's the permanent wage component, which for women was only 14.5% of their variance. It's up to 20.6% for the more recent cohort. And this is reflecting not a change in the variance of that. We didn't allow the variance to change. It's that women are working more. And so permanent wage heterogeneity has a much bigger direct impact on the family income of these women because they're using this part of their human capital in the market. For men, there's actually a bit of a drop, partly because they're no longer the whole show for family earnings. Women's share has been going up. And there's been a change in the role of heterogeneity in work that's even sharper for men than it is for women. But in this case, both go up. Then wage shocks, hour shocks, employment all play a role. They tend to wages become more important for women, less important for men, but it's not a big story. Okay, so the last slide that I'll spend some time on is the other sources of variation in family income per adult equivalent. So again, what I'm looking at here is that when I say family income per adult equivalent, I'm talking about lifetime. So it's age 25 to 55. So what we're doing here is, I won't say exactly how we did it, but with our model, there's a way to measure the contribution of randomness conditional on permanent heterogeneity and education in your sequence of marriages, including whether you're married at age 25, marital duration, and then you think of each state as a 0 or 1. Well, we basically were able to compute a complete index of marital history, and we then measure what's its contribution to marginal contribution to R squared. And I don't know of a paper that's done this before, and we did it in our prior paper. And we were surprised that it's not that big a deal. I thought it would be more important. It's for the women in the pre-baby boom cohort, it's 4.1% of the variance. It's 5.8, and I'll be done in a minute. It's 5.8% in the baby boom, and then it actually dropped back to 4.7. For the men, it was 5.2, and it's dropped to 2.5. Okay, so the last things I want to talk about are spouses' contributions. And this is the contribution of randomness in who you married. The other slide is already you're getting credit for your own education in that it's operating through who you marry. This is due to random variation. And what you can see is that for women in the pre-baby boom cohort, random variation in spouses' education is 6.8% of the variance, and it's fallen to about 5%. For men, it was only 1.8% of the variance. It's up to 3.1%. And then if you look at these permanent wage components, for women, that was 12.4% of the variance in their income as an adult. And this is all women. Some women that didn't even get married, okay? But it's against overall women. And that's dropped to 7.1%. For men, it's up from 2.1% to 3.3%. And then this is the spouse's autoregressive wage component. And again, that's dropped for women. It actually just went up slightly for men. And again, you see, those are the main. Then we have results for spouses heterogeneity, and that's the one that goes in the other direction. So I'm already a bit over, and I'll spare you an attempt at a summary. But what I do want to do is close, by saying, first, actually, my own first paper on earnings dynamics was actually with Aloysius. It's so deeply buried it actually was a revised and submitted econometrica that we just stopped working on. We both got tired and made this career mistake that we kind of seem to have survived. But we've had a long, I've been very fortunate to have known Aloysius for really almost my whole career. And despite his claims about going emeritus, I continue to, our journey in economics and in life will continue. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm sure this goes beyond the scope of this paper, and it's probably not easily tractable, but I was thinking about the cumulative nature of these shocks. I know you have to assume that they're uncorrelated, but I think it would be interesting to know in terms of the labor market attachment of women over time, if like divorce after a child or an employment shock after a child, these kind of cumulative shocks have differential effects by cohorts, and if this is something you're thinking about.
So we actually have graphs that show those, and it's a little bit more of it is actually in the prior paper, and that's not by cohort, but in the new paper for, I think, both for unemployment shocks, for divorce, we don't have employment, we have hours. As well as wages. So yeah, we do. And we're looking at the effects of, again, of wage shocks. Unfortunately, I'll misstate, what exactly what, I think I actually went by a couple ones that looked at the effects of unemployment shocks by, well, see if I can get there. Well, maybe I shouldn't, but we can talk later. Okay, thank you.
Well, this comes to the end of all the presentations, all the academic presentations. Thanks for everyone for being here. We wanted to invite Aloysius to come up to the front and give some final remarks to the whole audience.
Well, let me just say that I'm deeply honored and touched by all of you who are here, my colleagues, co-authors, students attending this conference. I want to thank all of you. It's nothing I could have imagined. I also want to thank, Gustavo and Rob for proposing this conference, the department for sponsoring it and funding it, and then Adriano for doing a lot of the logistics. So let me, one thing which I am really gratified by is the ex-students presentation today. I would say that it's amazing to see what they have done since they left me, so I must be holding them back. So, okay. In any case, I'm going to use this opportunity, I guess, just to talk about the research career that some of you already have heard about. And I would say that, and some of you notice, but I would say that partly my research has been, the way I think about problems have been driven mostly by anomalies. So things that suddenly I find a empirical feature that is inconsistent with the theories to date. And then they just stay in my mind. And every so often, the profession will discover either a new tool or a new data source. And then as soon as I think something like that, I look around the department and whichever department I happen to be and say, well, who knows this new stuff? And I've been very lucky, I would say, both at Columbia and here, is that they're amazing departments. So I can always find somebody who knows, has the latest expertise, and then I bug them and beg them to help me along. So essentially, whatever success I've had is really the communities that I've been around in, and I would say that I'm really privileged to have that opportunity. So my first co-author was basically Joe, and we started together. And he still has effects on me, even though it doesn't look like it. But you know, he thinks, and even now you can see he thinks in terms of behavioral regression models, and I have to put on his head explicitly to make sure I haven't forgotten things when I think about my models, because I don't start with behavioral regression models. I start with utility functions. So it's but in any case, that was a very productive, I would say, way for me to think about things. The other person which came with us to the market at the same time was Shelly. And like she says, I'm amazed that we never met each other before we entered the job market. Suddenly, she is one of the first people, even with her thesis was really on the added worker hypothesis, and she started working on the family way earlier than me. I mean, and Joe actually. So it was really a one of the pioneers in our cohort, I would say. I was a Gary Becker student, and I was interested in the family. But I started as a liberal economist because I thought Becker had done everything that was interesting about the family. Okay, so I didn't dare to go into it. I thought, my God, it's just going to look like I'm writing footnotes. And I would say the following: the first paper I wrote on the family, which is the one that Shelly kindly talked about, is not my idea. I actually read about it in about something that was written by a biologist. So at that time when I read it, I realized that economists and particularly Becker didn't know that it existed. So then, okay, I was willing to write something. But it wasn't really my original idea. Now, after that attempt, I didn't look back. And then, of course, my work with Maristella on dowries was again motivated by somebody outside economics, by Jack Goody, who is an anthropologist. Okay, and actually Becker had an exchange with him, and Becker says, "I don't think too much of this guy." Okay, but it didn't matter. The fact was, Goody did have something interesting to say, and Maristella and I thought, well, this is really a problem, and we should start thinking about it. And she had this beautiful data on Renaissance Tuscany, which was my first insight into essentially economic history. So most of my papers, not surprisingly, has very little practical implications. My most cited paper today is with Eugene on marriage matching function. Now, I'm too old to have dated online, but I really enjoy seeing an application of basically the largest online dating site in Taiwan used the Siow model as a recommendation system. Now, okay, if you see who they recommend that you pick, if you went to Taiwan, you would realize that Siow is at the back of it. Okay, so the last thing, I guess, as an anecdote I want to tell, which is kind of funny, is when I teach my undergraduates, one of the things I tell them, I say, look, if you want to work, you should marry down, okay? Because then you're going to get them to do more of the child rearing and the home production. And, the guys would just smirk. They don't say anything, and they just kind of smile. Okay, the women, most of them look a bit embarrassed. And then after the class, one or two of them will come up to me and say, well, I know you're right, but because of peer pressure, it's very hard for us to do something like that. And then I tell them, well, my wife did it. Thank you very much.
I have nothing else to add. Anyway, Aloysius, thank you. We're just so happy to be all of us here with you. One more round of applause for Aloysius.